My name is Dakota, and this story begins on the morning that changed everything in my life. The morning my mother tried to erase me entirely from the world. The morning that marked the beginning of a silence I would carry for 16 long years. I woke up to sunlight barely touching the edges of my blinds, spilling thin, golden threads across the faded carpet of my small bedroom. The light danced on the walls, painting shapes that shifted as the wind nudged the trees outside, a quiet prelude to the storm I didn't yet understand. I was 7 years old, fragile in body but sharp in mind, small hands gripping the wheels of my chair like they were lifelines, fingers twitching with the nervous energy that always preceded moments that mattered, moments I couldn't yet name. Claudine, my mother, moved through the house with her usual perfection that morning, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors, a sound that usually made me shrink and hold my breath as if the echo itself could reach into me and unravel my existence. But this time, her footsteps carried a rhythm that was unfamiliar, almost soft, almost melodic. She was humming, a sound so unnatural coming from her that my chest tightened, a warning I was too young to fully decode. Claudine never hummed. Her life, her presence, had always been composed like a sculpture, each gesture calculated, precise, like the curves and angles of marble that could never be touched without fear of breaking them. And yet that morning, she was humming while she packed a basket, folding a red gingham cloth with an exaggerated care, arranging sandwiches, napkins, juice boxes, and even my little crayon set with a meticulousness that felt rehearsed, like she was following some script written by someone else. I had watched her hundreds of times from the hallway, my small eyes catching every detail, every twitch of her fingers, every flash of her eyes that told me more than words ever could. And yet, I knew, deep down, this was different. This morning was different. Something in her movements, the way she lingered over the basket, the way her eyes darted briefly to the window before meeting mine, told me that the perfect act I was witnessing had a darkness hiding just behind it. My voice, usually dismissed, ignored, or sometimes scolded, felt lighter this morning. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps it was naive trust, but I tried to reach out. "Mommy," I said, wheeling slowly into the kitchen, my voice trembling like a fragile leaf in a breeze. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief, fleeting moment, they softened. "Morning, baby," she said, a smile curving on her lips that seemed almost human, almost warm, and my chest ached with a mixture of relief and something I couldn't quite name. "We're going on a picnic. Just you and me." The words struck me like a promise, an oasis in the usual desert of her cold perfection. But they were a lie wrapped in sunlight and sweetness, a carefully constructed illusion of love that would later unravel in ways I could never have imagined. I remember the drive vividly. The car glided over back roads lined with towering pines, their scent mixing with the faint, familiar perfume that Claudine always wore, a smell of flowers and something sharp, like cold metal. The radio hummed softly with jazz, the kind that made the car feel small, intimate, but even this calm had a tension underneath it that I couldn't yet name. Claudine's hands were poised on the steering wheel, her nails clicking lightly against the gear shift, tapping to the rhythm of music only she could hear. Sunlight filtered through the windshield, tracing the sharp lines of her cheekbones, highlighting the flawless curve of her jaw, casting shadows that made her look like a painting I wasn't allowed to touch. I tried to speak, commenting on the rustling of leaves, the way birds flew alongside the car for a brief moment, the soft hum of life outside that felt like a secret only I noticed. She responded with a nod, a gentle whisper of, "Just you and me, baby," as if she were sealing some hidden covenant between us, a covenant that would later turn into a nightmare I would relive in my mind for years to come. We drove for what felt like hours, though the world outside passed in minutes. The sunlight changed as we wound through hidden trails, narrow paths I had never seen, surrounded by towering pines whose trunks reached toward the sky like guardians of an ancient secret. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the air, mixing with her perfume, creating a heady, confusing perfume of safety and danger that made my stomach twist with unspoken anxiety. When we finally reached the overlook, I realized the beauty of the world in that instant, the deep gorge below, the river snaking through it like a silver thread, the trees clinging to jagged cliffs, the guardrail rusted and bent, creeping with vines like the forest was trying to reclaim what humans had imposed. She lifted me from the car, hands firm yet delicate, like handling a fragile doll she might crush if she pressed too hard. She placed me into my wheelchair, adjusted my blanket, arranged the picnic basket with a perfection that made me suspect she had rehearsed it 1,000 times in her mind. Everything about that moment was wrong. Too perfect, too serene, like the eye of a storm, quiet before the crash. I clutched my crayons, trying to distract myself with their colors, the mundane joy of simple things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted under my feet. And then, softly, almost tenderly, she whispered, "Sometimes we have to make hard choices, grown-up choices." My small hands trembled, and my voice, barely audible, asked, "What do you mean?" There was no answer, only the click of her heels, the faint rustle of the wind through the pines, and the slow, deliberate movement of the wheelchair toward the edge. And in that slow, syrupy, terrifying moment, my life tilted irrevocably, spiraling into a silence I would carry with me for 16 long, unbroken years. The moment her hands gripped the wheelchair handles, something in the air shifted. The sun glinted off her polished heels, the metal of the chair, the glassy leaves of the forest around us. I remember my heart beating so fast I thought it might burst through my chest, every thump echoing in my ears like a warning bell I couldn't ignore. I was frozen, fingers tightening around the armrests, eyes wide as I watched her lean closer, whispering, so soft I barely heard her words, "I have to let go." And then it happened. The world moved without me. The wheels rolled forward, slowly, deliberately, over the gravel that crunched beneath them in a rhythm that felt eerily like a countdown. My stomach twisted, the chill of fear crawling up my spine as I realized there was no turning back. The edge of the cliff loomed in front of me, a yawning mouth of stone and air, and then it was beneath me, the drop swallowing the world in one terrifying second. I remember the first sensation vividly, the air rushing past, thick and heavy, stealing my breath before the water even touched me. Time slowed, stretched like taffy, and every detail carved itself into my memory. The light fractured through the trees above, glinting off the river far below, catching my crayons as they spilled from my lap, scattering like tiny pieces of my childhood, colored fragments of a life I had barely begun to live. I screamed, not for help, not for the river that was about to claim me, but for her. For my mother. For the woman who had promised love and trust just moments ago, before she turned my world into a nightmare. The scream ripped from my chest, raw and jagged, a sound swallowed immediately by the wind and the rushing water below. The fall wasn't long, but it was infinite. Every second stretched into eternity as my body plummeted, the cold air slapping my face, the wind clawing at my hair, the river waiting silently to embrace me. And then the water struck, sharp and icy, stealing the rest of my breath and wrapping my body in its merciless, unyielding weight. My legs, lifeless and unresponsive, dragged me down, useless anchors that refused to fight the current, while my arms flailed desperately above me, seeking something, anything to hold on to. The river didn't care about my cries, my terror, or my betrayal. It was a wall of liquid darkness, indifferent, cold and final. And I thought this was it, that I would dissolve into its depths, a body erased, a presence forgotten. But then, amidst the relentless current, something unexpected happened. My hand struck something solid, rough, wet, and stubborn. It was a gnarled tree root jutting out from the slope beneath the cliff, tangled in mud, moss, and the silent determination of the forest itself. I didn't pause to think. I just grabbed it, fingers scraping against bark that tore my skin, shoulders screaming with the strain, but I held on with a desperation that surprised even me. The water slammed into my side, trying to rip me away, but I refused. My body trembled, teeth chattering, legs useless, arms burning, yet still I held on. It felt like hours, though perhaps it was only minutes, suspended between the abyss and the tenuous grip of the tree root. My mind raced, flashes of birthdays uncelebrated, drawings never hung on the fridge, nights spent begging for love that never came. Each memory pressed into me with weight as tangible as the river itself, and I realized, painfully, that I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of being forgotten, of disappearing entirely from the world as if I had never existed. And then, through the roar of the river and the deafening silence of my own thoughts, I heard it, a voice. rough, male desperate. Hey! Hey! Hold on! It sliced through the chaos, an unexpected lifeline, a promise that maybe the world hadn't abandoned me entirely. My head tried to turn, but my neck burned, my shoulders refused to obey, my body locked in place by exhaustion and terror. Boots splashed through the water, getting closer, and then warmth, real, solid, human warmth, wrapped around me. Strong arms secured my torso, one hand gripping under my armpit, the other around my waist. The tree root slipped from my grasp, and I collapsed into the stranger's hold, gasping, shaking, the river still attempting to claim me, but he didn't let go. Step by step, he dragged us both to the muddy bank, fighting against the current, refusing to relinquish the fragile life in his arms. When we finally reached solid ground, he laid me down gently, cradling my head on his knee. I coughed violently, half water, half shock, unable to understand the sudden shift from near death to rescue. My body trembled uncontrollably, cold and wet, yet paradoxically, I felt a seed of safety I hadn't known since before Claudine's betrayal. His voice, rough but gentle, cut through my panic. "You're all right now." I blinked up at him, taking in his long, wet beard, tired but kind eyes, maybe in his 50s, maybe older, coat soaked through but unbothered. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He nodded slowly, reading the silence as agreement. "It's okay. We'll figure it out." He lifted me again, holding me with the care of a man who had learned to treasure the fragile, cradling me as if I weighed nothing, as if my life was something sacred to protect. And in that moment, shivering, soaked, palms bleeding from bark, wearing a dress now ruined by mud and water, I felt held, not just physically, but emotionally, in a way I had never known. The cabin, he led me to smelled of cedar and old books, fire crackling in the hearth, while blankets draped across hand-carved chairs. There was no rush, no questions, just calm, quiet efficiency. He dried me, fed me warm broth, bandaged my palms. And as I lay curled on the cot that first night, the fire casting flickering shadows, he finally said, "You were holding on like you meant it. That tree root didn't stand a chance." A weak, grateful smile escaped me. He asked my name. Dakota. But the name was tainted, given by the woman who tried to erase me, so I shook my head. "All right," he said gently. "How about Sky?" And in that single word, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Choice, life, identity reclaimed from the edge of oblivion. The days that followed in Elmer's cabin were unlike anything I had ever known. The world outside, Sacramento, my mother, the lie of my death, was a distant, nearly unreal memory, softened by time but jagged at the edges whenever it threatened to surface. Inside the cabin, everything was tangible, immediate, alive. The scent of cedarwood burned gently in my nostrils, mingling with the faint aroma of smoke from the fireplace, creating a space that was warm, safe, and brutally honest in a way the outside world had never been. The walls themselves seemed alive, carved with stories of the past, etched by Elmer's own hands, each scratch and dent a memory preserved, a reminder that time moved differently here, slower, deliberate, and forgiving. I spent my days watching him move through the cabin, small, precise motions that spoke of patience honed over decades. He never asked me to hurry, never demanded my attention, never forced conversation when words felt heavy or impossible. I was free to be still, free to watch the flicker of flames in the hearth, the way shadows danced across the floorboards, the way dust motes caught the light and hung in the air like tiny ghosts of forgotten lives. At first, I didn't speak much. My voice had been silenced for so long, not just by Claudine's betrayal, but by my own fear of being unwanted, that it felt foreign to even try. Yet, in that quiet, I began to feel a different kind of presence, a validation that came not from words or praise, but from consistent, unwavering attention. Elmer did not need explanations. He did not demand justification. He simply existed as a steady anchor in the chaos that had become my life. The first week was a blur of survival. He taught me simple things at first: how to grip a pencil without straining my wrists, how to balance my weight in the wheelchair when navigating the uneven floorboards, how to place wood in the fireplace so that it burned evenly and safely. Each lesson was small, almost mundane, but for me, it was revolutionary. I had been rendered powerless by my mother's actions, by my own body's limitations, and by the cruel hand of fate that had tossed me into a river and presumed I would sink. Yet here, each tiny victory felt monumental. The first time I managed to carve a small block of cedar into something recognizable, the first time I could push my wheelchair across the cabin floor without assistance, the first night I slept without waking in panic, expecting the world to betray me again. Elmer's presence was like gravity, steady and invisible, holding me in place so I could rebuild, brick by brick, the parts of myself Claudine had tried to erase. Food became a ritual. Simple, hearty meals that smelled like home but weren't. Beans and potatoes, broth made from roots and vegetables, small bits of bread warmed in the fire. He fed me gently, setting bowls in front of me, making sure the food was within reach, never rushing, never treating me like a child despite my age and vulnerability. Each meal was an exercise in reclaiming control. I learned to lift my spoon steadily, to drink from a cup without spilling, to take bites in a rhythm that didn't terrify me. The ordinary became extraordinary in its own way, every mundane act a rebellion against the helplessness I had felt for years. And then there were the sketches. The first day I discovered the stack of blank, textured paper tucked in a drawer, untouched and waiting, I felt something inside me ignite. It was a spark I hadn't known existed, a flame of creation, a whisper of defiance. I started with simple drawings, the trees outside the window, the outline of the cliff I had fallen from, the river below, the twisted roots that had nearly claimed me. But soon, the images became sharper, darker, more deliberate. Legs dangling over the cliff edge. A faceless girl flailing through the air, hands grasping at nothing. I didn't realize Elmer had seen the sketches until he left a new pencil at the edge of the table the next morning, silent acknowledgement of the story I was telling without words. It became our unspoken dialogue. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. We communicated through art, through gesture, through the quiet acknowledgement that pain and survival could exist without the need for justification. Evenings were spent by the fire, shadows dancing across my sketches, flames crackling as if echoing my heartbeat. Elmer would hum softly sometimes, a different tune than Claudine ever had, a tune of steadiness and familiarity. He told fragments of his life, small, personal anecdotes that carried weight because they were given freely, without expectation. He had once lived in the city, Portland, perhaps, or Seattle, but the details weren't important. What mattered was that he had loved and lost, that he knew grief, and that he had chosen to carve a life from solitude rather than bitterness. He spoke of a daughter, quiet, small, with a love for messy painting and oversized sweaters, taken by leukemia at age 10. His words were heavy, raw, and yet comforting because they acknowledged pain without letting it define the present. He showed me a painting later, dark and layered in broad, angry strokes, not beautiful, not sad, just raw, an artwork demanding to be witnessed. I understood. This was my mirror, my voice, my silent scream poured onto paper, something that could not be ignored. Weeks passed, seasons shifted imperceptibly. I learned the rhythm of the cabin, the way fog thickened in the mornings, how the air shifted with approaching storms, how Elmer's bones ached when the cold crept in. Time became measured in sketches, in carved wood, in silent walks to the small stream outside, the water cold and biting, yet somehow cleansing. Mason, the young man delivering supplies once a week, became a distant part of the world, his presence tolerated but peripheral, like the rest of humanity that had existed before my fall. I was learning to exist on my own terms, to reclaim the self Claudine had tried to bury, brick by brick, stroke by stroke, heartbeat by heartbeat. And in the quiet of those nights, alone with the fire and the hum of life slowly returning to my limbs, I realized something profound. Survival was no longer enough. Healing was not just a word, but an act, a deliberate choice to reclaim what had been stolen. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the shock, the anger, and the cold ache of betrayal, a seed of something else began to take root. It was a small, quiet promise that I would rise. Not for revenge yet, not with anger, but to exist fully, to witness, to show that erasure was never final. The cliff, the river, Claudine's cruelty, they had failed to end me. And now, slowly, painfully, I was beginning to reclaim a life that had been denied to me. The first time I allowed myself to think about Claudine in a way other than with fear or despair, it was like a dangerous spark in a dry forest. The fire that had been slowly rekindling in me now blazed with an intensity one hadn't felt since before the betrayal. I knew it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, more consuming, a recognition that I had survived her worst, and now she needed to recognize that she hadn't won. The cabin felt quieter that morning, the fog curling like smoke outside the window, and I sat cross-legged on the floor, sketches spread in a chaotic circle around me, each one a memory, a scream, a promise, a strategy. Elmer watched silently from the corner, sipping his coffee, eyes sharp but patient, like a general waiting for his soldier to marshal her own strength. He said nothing, and I didn't need him to. It started small. Names, dates, places, details I had buried under layers of trauma. Claudine had never considered the network she had created around her, the web of lies, manipulations, and small cruelties that kept everyone too busy to notice the truth. I remember conversations she had thought were private, moments of complacency when she underestimated me, underestimated my capacity for observation and memory. I compiled them mentally at first, then on paper, then with the sketches themselves, each image a map, a coded message, a way to remember not just her power, but her weaknesses. My body was healing, my mind sharpening, every muscle in my arms and back that had lain dormant now ready for action. But this wasn't about brute strength. Claudine had power in her world because she manipulated perception, controlled information, and hid behind the facades of civility. To confront her would require precision, planning, and patience. I began with small tests of myself, mental exercises, mapping her likely routines, visualizing confrontations and outcomes. The sketches evolved from mere depictions of trauma to strategic diagrams, lines connecting actions to consequences, symbols for people, places, and vulnerabilities. Each night, I pored over them until my eyes stung and my hands cramped, until the fire in the hearth was a dull glow and the moonlight cast long, accusing shadows across the floor. Elmer never interrupted these sessions. Sometimes he would slide a pencil across the table without a word. Sometimes he would hum, almost a melody of encouragement, and I would continue, drawing, planning, reconstructing not just my life, but a path to reclaiming justice. The emotional weight was unbearable at times. Memories surged unexpectedly, a birthday ruined, a scream unheard, the cold isolation of the basement where Claudine had tried to erase me. I remembered the way the river had felt, the sting of its icy grip, the panic and helplessness as I fought to hold on. I allowed myself to cry, fully, without shame, letting the river of tears mirror the one I had survived, washing the rage, fear, and pain into something I could wield with clarity instead of letting it consume me. I learned to separate anger from purpose. Anger alone was chaos. Purpose was power. And now, for the first time in years, I felt both coursing through me, intertwining, pushing me to act with the precision of a storm contained, rather than a storm unleashed. Elmer's presence was a constant reminder that planning required more than emotion. It required patience and discipline. He taught me survival skills beyond the cabin, reading terrain, understanding human behavior, observing without being seen. He introduced me to techniques of discretion, how to leave no trace, how to recognize traps set by those who thought they controlled others, how to turn fear into fuel rather than paralysis. I soaked it all in, relentless, absorbing every lesson, every insight, every warning. The cabin became a training ground, a crucible for rebirth. My sketches, once chaotic and emotional, now combined artistry with precision, turning into a visual blueprint for the confrontation I knew I would have to face. The realization that Claudine would never see me as powerless again was intoxicating. I imagined her reaction, not just fear, but disbelief, anger, the cognitive dissonance of having underestimated me for so long. The careful planning consumed me, yet it also gave me a sense of peace. Each day I woke, I checked my own resolve. Could I face her without losing myself to rage? Could I act with purpose rather than impulse? Could I survive morally as well as physically? These were not easy questions. Sometimes I failed, pacing the cabin floor in frustration, shouting into the empty air, or collapsing in tears onto the rug by the fire. Yet each failure only reinforced my determination, teaching me resilience in addition to strategy. I began visualizing the world beyond the cabin, The city streets, the people I had left behind, the places Claudine frequented, her patterns, her assumptions. I imagined infiltrating her world without detection, creating small interventions, leaving no room for suspicion. Every action, every observation, every detail became part of a larger map that I could read with clarity born from suffering. The sketches multiplied, each one a silent witness, each line a thread connecting past, present, and future, weaving a plan that felt almost sacred in its precision. And yet, amidst all this plotting and scheming, the cabin in Elmer grounded me in humanity. The fire's warmth, the smell of coffee, the simplicity of shared meals, the small act of carving wood or painting leaves onto paper, they reminded me why I survived. This wasn't about vengeance alone. It was about reclamation, about proving to myself that Claudine's attempts to erase me had failed utterly. I was not just a survivor. I was a force, a mind sharpened by betrayal and tempered by care, ready to step back into a world that had believed I was broken. The day I finally allowed myself to imagine stepping out of the cabin with purpose, fully in control, was the day I knew that the plan was ready, not complete, not exact, but ready to begin. The morning I decided to leave the cabin for the first time in months, the air was heavy with mist, each breath a chill that sank into my lungs and made my resolve sharper. I had trained for this moment without knowing it, every sketch, every exercise, every moment of solitude a rehearsal for stepping back into a world that had tried to erase me. Elmer had made no attempt to stop me, only offering a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that I was ready, or at least as ready as I could ever be. The wheelchair, now fitted with subtle modifications he had crafted himself, rolled silently across the cabin floor as I packed the essentials. A few clothes, the sketches that had become my secret arsenal, and a small, sturdy bag filled with supplies I might need for sustenance and observation. Even the act of leaving felt like a test. The door loomed ahead like the mouth of a challenge I had to face alone. The first few hours outside the cabin were disorienting. The fog blurred familiar landmarks, turning the forest into an indistinct, shifting world. Each sound, birdsong, rustling leaves, distant water, felt amplified, each shadow a possible threat. But with every turn of the wheels, every careful maneuver over uneven ground, I felt something inside me strengthen. The outside world had been terrifying before, but now it was a stage for my vigilance, a landscape I had mapped in my mind from 1,000 sketches. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the raw energy of anticipation. I remembered Claudine's face, her arrogance, her certainty that I would never recover, and I felt a surge of clarity. She had underestimated me, and that underestimation was my advantage. By midday, I had reached the edge of the small town bordering the forest. People moved with casual indifference, unaware of the storm that had been quietly gathering, the quiet eye of which was seated in a wheelchair, observing them with sharp, calculating eyes. I had spent countless hours studying human behavior, noting patterns, and now I could see them in motion. The subtle signals of tension, the small gestures of arrogance, the blind spots people left when they assumed no one was watching. Claudine had always believed that people could be controlled through perception and fear. Now I realized perception could be a weapon. I was learning to wield it with precision. The first encounter with a stranger tested my resolve. A man walking his dog glanced too closely at my sketches, curiosity flickering in his eyes. My pulse quickened, but I maintained composure, offering a calm nod and a soft smile. He looked away, unconcerned. I felt the first real taste of power, the ability to navigate the world without panic, without revealing the storm I carried inside. Every interaction became a rehearsal, every glance a chance to measure control. By the time I reached the town's cafe, I had begun to sense the rhythm of human movement again, my instincts tuned to observation and strategy rather than fear. Inside the cafe, I ordered a simple meal, careful to note the layout, the exits, and the people present. Every detail mattered. I observed the waitress's habits, the patterns of customers, the timing of deliveries. It all seemed trivial, but it was practice, training my mind to anticipate, to calculate, to integrate survival into the mundane. And as I sat there, spooning soup carefully, I felt the first true stirrings of purpose. Not just survival, not just preparation, but the first conscious connection to the plan that would one day confront Claudine directly. Each sketch I had drawn, Each observation I had made was no longer just a private exercise. It was a blueprint for action, a silent declaration that the world I had left behind would not remain unchallenged. Returning to the forest that evening was surreal. The cabin felt smaller, more intimate, more sacred. I unpacked my bag and laid out the sketches once again, tracing the lines with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. I began mapping Claudine's routines in the same way I had mapped the town: patterns, vulnerabilities, timings, and predictabilities. The sketches evolved once more from emotional catharsis to tactical strategy. Each line became sharper, each symbol more deliberate. I allowed myself brief moments of reflection, thinking of the river, the cliff, the betrayal, and finally, the strength I had nurtured in isolation. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing across the sketches like ghosts of the past whispering warnings, and I felt a strange satisfaction. I was ready, not yet for confrontation, but for the first steps that would inevitably lead to it. Night brought silence, but also clarity. I traced my hands over the carvings on the wooden walls, feeling the resonance of time and patience, absorbing Elmer's lessons once more. I allowed myself to imagine the eventual confrontation, picturing Claudine's disbelief, the subtle unraveling of her carefully constructed control, the moment she would realize that the child she thought destroyed had returned, stronger, smarter, unbroken. The visualization was vivid. Her face, the slight tightening of her lips, the tremor of fear she would never admit. My heart surged not with hatred alone, but with a quiet triumph of survival, the power of patience, and the inevitability of justice meticulously planned. As I prepared for sleep, the sketches arranged neatly for reference, I allowed one final thought to settle. The world outside was vast, unpredictable, and dangerous, but I had emerged from isolation not merely healed, but sharpened, tempered like steel and fire. The cabin had been my sanctuary, Elmer my guide, but the forest, the town, the very spaces Claudine had manipulated, all of it was now my canvas. I was ready to move, to observe, to act, and to let the slow, deliberate mechanics of revenge unfold with precision. And in that moment, as the fire guttered and shadows stretched across the floor, I understood something profound. Survival was no longer enough. I had become a force of reckoning, a silent storm, preparing to step into the world and claim what had been denied to me. The days that followed my cautious re-entry into the town were a strange combination of exhilaration and anxiety. Every movement outside the cabin was deliberate, every interaction calculated. I had become hyper-aware of sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of conversations, the shuffle of feet across pavement. These sounds, once mundane, now carried the weight of opportunity and risk. My sketches evolved into living maps, constantly updated with observations. The direction Claudine might take if she noticed me, the patterns of her friends and allies, the blind spots she assumed were secure. Each line, each note, each subtle symbol became a silent guide to an encounter I knew would one day come, an encounter I had envisioned countless times during nights in the cabin. The first true test came unexpectedly. While navigating a narrow street lined with shops and cafes, I caught sight of a familiar figure from the corner of my eye. Her posture, the tilt of her head, the confident stride, it was unmistakable. Claudine. My pulse quickened, my palms itched with anticipation, but I forced myself to maintain a calm exterior. There was no room for recklessness. The world outside was not the cabin. Here, every move had consequences. I ducked behind a lamppost, letting the folds of my jacket blend into the shadows, observing her silently. Claudine's aura of authority had not diminished. She moved with the same controlled grace, unaware that the person she had once sought to destroy now watched her, cataloging every gesture, every subtle tell. The adrenaline surged, but I breathed deliberately, grounding myself. This was not the moment to act. It was the moment to see, to learn, to anticipate. My sketches came alive in my mind as I noted her route, the shops she frequented, the slight hesitation as she navigated the crowd. I realized the power of observation, not just as a means of strategy, but as a tool to reclaim my presence in a world she had assumed I would never step into again. I traced mental lines between past encounters and present observations, mapping not just the streets, but the vulnerabilities of Claudine herself. Each misstep she might take, each assumption she held about my absence, became a potential leverage point. Returning to the relative safety of a nearby park, I allowed myself a brief respite, sitting on a weathered bench, observing the shifting light of the afternoon sun. I reviewed the events in my mind, replaying Claudine's movements as if they were scenes in a rehearsal. The fog of fear that had once clouded my judgment was gone, replaced by clarity and purpose. I had anticipated this encounter for months, yet seeing her in reality, a living, breathing presence in the very streets I had once avoided, was surreal. The thought of approaching, confronting, or merely signaling my existence to her was tantalizing, but I reminded myself of the lesson Elmer had drilled into me: patience and timing were everything. Impulsive actions could ruin months of preparation. Night fell, and with it, the quiet tension of anticipation settled over me. I returned to the cabin, retracing my path with caution, noting possible exits and vantage points for future observation. Each sketch I created that evening layered more detail into my plan: potential allies and threats, the timing of Claudine's movements, subtle patterns in her routine that could be exploited. The sketches no longer represented mere survival. They had transformed into instruments of tactical precision, each stroke a silent signal of the reckoning to come. I allowed myself a moment to feel the weight of both fear and exhilaration, understanding that the complexity of the world outside demanded not just physical readiness, but mental acuity and emotional discipline. In the solitude of the cabin, I prepared for what would inevitably come next. I reviewed my previous encounters, analyzing not just Claudine's actions, but her likely psychological responses to someone she believed absent. How would she react to a silent observer, a presence she could not ignore? How could I manipulate perception, influence her choices, and position myself in a way that preserved both safety and leverage? The questions were numerous, but the answers lay in the meticulous preparation I had undertaken for months. I traced my fingers over the sketches, imagining the eventual confrontation as a series of calculated moves and countermoves, each step designed to maintain control while subtly unbalancing Claudine's sense of certainty. Sleep that night was restless. Dreams intertwined past trauma with future strategy, blending memory with possibility. I saw the basement, the river, the betrayal, and simultaneously, the streets, the cafes, the crowd, all forming a stage upon which the next chapter of my life would unfold. The tension of anticipation was almost tangible, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that I was no longer powerless. I had become an observer, a strategist, a survivor who had transformed suffering into strength. The mental rehearsal was rigorous, ensuring that every emotional response, every instinctual reaction, was aligned with the overarching plan. I awoke with the first light of dawn, my mind clear, my purpose sharp, ready to navigate the next phase of reintegration into the world. The days that followed were a careful dance of presence and discretion. I moved through the town with an almost imperceptible awareness, noting Claudine's locations, monitoring her interactions, and refining my understanding of her behavioral patterns. I tested subtle signals of influence, leaving sketches in places she might observe indirectly, timing movements to intersect with her routine, and gauging reactions from people in her orbit. Each interaction was a thread, woven into a tapestry that would eventually reveal a path to direct confrontation, executed not with reckless emotion, but with calculated precision. By the end of the week, I had constructed a mental blueprint of Claudine's daily life, her favored routes, habitual pauses, moments of distraction, and the people she trusted unquestioningly. I felt the first real stirrings of control, the realization that the long months of isolation, training, and observation had culminated in a readiness that extended beyond mere survival. I was no longer invisible, but I was unseen in the way that mattered, able to navigate her world while remaining a force she could not anticipate. The suspense was electric, a tangible current that energized my mind and body, sharpening focus and reinforcing the clarity of purpose that had been nurtured in the cabin. The morning air was crisp as I left the cabin once again, the wheelchair rolling silently over the gravel path. Today felt different, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that pulsed through every fiber of my being. I had observed Claudine long enough to know that subtlety would be my greatest weapon. Direct confrontation was still dangerous, but small, calculated movements could begin to unsettle her world. I had rehearsed this for weeks, mapping routes, noting behavioral patterns, and imagining the precise timing of every encounter. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could provide cover, and every glance could be a signal of unseen influence. The world outside had shifted from a place of caution to a stage where strategy could unfold. As I approached the town, I made mental adjustments, shifting my focus from survival to manipulation. Today, the plan was to introduce uncertainty into Claudine's meticulously controlled life. I had left small, subtle traces in previous days, sketches partially visible from windows, fleeting glimpses of movement that could be interpreted as coincidence, but now I intended to escalate the psychological tension. I moved carefully, observing the flow of pedestrians, noting which shops she frequented, and timing my progress to intersect with her predictable routes. The anticipation was electric, my pulse a metronome that kept my mind alert, yet focused. The first sign of Claudine appeared just past the corner of the small bakery she always visited on Wednesday mornings. She was exactly as I had imagined, confident, poised, radiating authority in a way that demanded attention. But today, there was a subtle hesitation in her step, a slight narrowing of the eyes as if sensing something amiss. My heart surged, not with fear, but with the thrill of control. I remained hidden behind a nearby lamppost, letting the shadows cloak my presence. Every movement, every breath, was deliberate. I observed her scanning the street, pausing briefly to glance at the corner where I had been. That pause, almost imperceptible, was my first victory, a flicker of uncertainty that would grow over time. As she entered the bakery, I positioned myself near a window, sketchbook in hand, appearing engrossed in notes, while my eyes flickered discreetly toward her. I noted the way she interacted with the cashier, the subtle gestures that betrayed a hint of unease. The sketches I had been working on were no longer just visual representations of her routines. They had become instruments of anticipation, allowing me to predict and influence her reactions. I began to imagine the psychological chain reactions this subtle presence could trigger: minor hesitation in her decisions, doubt creeping into her controlled demeanor, the sense that someone was watching, waiting, and calculating. Leaving the bakery behind, I allowed the day to unfold in careful increments, maintaining proximity without detection. I moved with precision, noting Claudine's every pause, every slight deviation from routine. I left traces in places she might notice indirectly: a folded sketch tucked into a mailbox, a mark on the pavement that mimicked an arrow pointing in a direction she did not expect. These small acts were my first tangible steps into a confrontation that would not be physical, but psychological. I could almost feel the subtle shifts in her world, the tiny tremors of disruption that would eventually accumulate into a full unraveling of her certainty. Returning to the park that evening, I paused to observe the interplay of light and shadow, imagining the paths Claudine would take tomorrow and the day after. My sketches grew more complex, layered with notes and symbols that mapped not just the physical world, but the emotional currents that ran beneath it. Every observation became a strategy, every calculated risk a preparation for the inevitable. I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection, tracing my fingers over the lines that represented her predictable patterns, imagining the first signs of doubt as they manifested in her behavior. It was intoxicating, this ability to influence without direct contact, to unsettle without confrontation, to reclaim presence in a life that had once sought to erase me. Night descended, bringing with it the deep, reflective silence of the cabin. I reviewed the day, noting every detail, every reaction, every subtle shift in Claudine's demeanor. The sketches became a mosaic of anticipation, mapping both opportunity and risk. I traced the paths she would follow, the intersections where my presence might be perceived, the micro moments of hesitation that could be leveraged. I imagined her noticing a shadow where none existed, sensing movement in an empty street, the slow accumulation of doubt that would eventually undermine her confidence. My mind was a theater of strategy, rehearsing scenes of subtle disruption and silent assertion. Sleep was restless but purposeful. Dreams intertwined past trauma with future moves, blending the memory of confinement and betrayal with the anticipation of strategic influence. I saw Claudine's confident posture falter in fleeting moments, glimpsed hesitation in her eyes, and imagined the growing awareness that someone she had dismissed as powerless was orchestrating subtle interventions in her life. These visions were not fantasies. They were rehearsals, mental simulations that prepared me for every eventuality. I awoke with a sharpened sense of clarity, understanding that the first subtle moves, though small, were the foundation for a confrontation that would eventually demand more direct engagement. The next morning, I moved through the town with deliberate attention, observing Claudine's routine as she unknowingly navigated spaces I had prepared. Each step I took was measured, every glance calculated, every sketch a reinforcement of the strategy. I left subtle markers, slight changes in the environment, small signs that something was amiss, whispers of presence that would slowly grow into suspicion. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, unseen, pervasive, and impossible to ignore once recognized. The tension was almost tangible, a low hum of anticipation that carried through every encounter, every observation, every calculated pause. By the end of the day, I had established the framework for ongoing influence. Claudine's world subtly shifted in response to my presence, each interaction layered with uncertainty, each observation a silent signal of calculated attention. I felt the first real taste of power, the ability to unsettle without confrontation, to reclaim control over a world she had assumed was secure. The sketches, once private exercises of memory and emotion, had transformed into instruments of psychological strategy, guiding the next moves of a plan that would unfold with precision. The following morning, the air felt heavier, charged with a tension that was both intoxicating and disorienting. I maneuvered through the town streets with a heightened awareness, every movement deliberate, every glance calculated. The previous days had established a rhythm of silent observation, but today I intended to escalate, to move beyond passive surveillance and introduce a psychological pressure that Claudine would not be able to ignore. I had studied her patterns, noted her confidence in the predictable, and now I planned to subtly disrupt the narrative she believed she controlled. Every corner, every alleyway, every familiar shop became a chessboard, each element a potential instrument of influence. I positioned myself near the small cafe she often visited, watching from a distance as she arrived. Claudine's composure remained impeccable, yet I detected micro-expressions, fleeting hesitations in her eyes, a slight narrowing of the jaw, the subtle tension in her shoulders. These were the first cracks in her carefully constructed armor, and I could feel the satisfaction of anticipation coursing through me. The plan was not to confront her directly, yet, but to create a persistent, unignorable presence, to introduce a pattern of doubt and uncertainty that would gnaw at her subconscious. Using the sketches I had developed over weeks, I began to orchestrate a sequence of subtle interventions. A mark on a street lamp here, a folded sketch left where she might notice it there, and even small, almost imperceptible noises timed to coincide with her path. Each action was designed to provoke a sense of unease, a whisper in her awareness that something was off, that the world she assumed she understood was subtly shifting. I imagined the mental process she would undergo, questioning her perceptions, doubting her assumptions, feeling that elusive, creeping presence of someone observing, influencing, and waiting. As she moved through the cafe, I noted the way she paused slightly longer at the counter, her eyes flickering to a window where my shadow might have been cast. I could almost see the internal calculations. Why did it feel like someone was watching, even when the street appeared empty? I stayed hidden, yet every detail was intentional, every movement a part of the larger orchestration. This psychological pressure was far more powerful than any direct confrontation could be. It was invisible, relentless, and deeply unsettling. The knowledge that I could influence her perception without revealing myself brought a surge of empowerment that mingled with the adrenaline in my veins. By midday, the subtle campaign had begun to leave its mark. Claudine's gait showed slight hesitation, her head tilted more frequently as if listening for cues, her eyes scanning corners and reflections in ways they hadn't before. Each sketch I left, each carefully placed marker, functioned as a signal, the suggestion that someone existed just outside her awareness, someone capable of observing and reacting with precision. I could almost hear the whispers of doubt forming in her mind, a quiet questioning of certainty that would grow in intensity with each passing moment. The emotional tension within me was mirrored in the streets I navigated. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential signal. I traced Claudine's route with meticulous care, anticipating her pauses, the places she might check, the subtle ways she might react to disturbances. The sketches in my notebook became a living map of influence, layered with the psychological fingerprints of every calculated action. Each stroke of the pen represented an intersection of observation, anticipation, and control, tools with which I was subtly reshaping her perception of reality. By late afternoon, I positioned myself near a small park where Claudine often took a brief walk after her errands. I remained just outside the line of sight, rolling my wheelchair slowly, ensuring that any shadow movement or subtle noise would be perceived as accidental but thought-provoking. I watched as she hesitated at the edge of the park, a faint frown crossing her face, the smallest trace of unease now evident in her posture. My careful orchestration was working. The psychological tension I had introduced was unfolding exactly as intended, imperceptible yet unavoidable in its cumulative effect. Returning to the cabin that evening, I reviewed the day with a sense of methodical satisfaction. Every sketch, every note, every observation had been catalogued, analyzed, and incorporated into the ongoing strategy. Claudine's reactions were subtle, but unmistakable, a shift in routine, an increase in vigilance, a fleeting glance over her shoulder. These micro-changes signaled the success of a first phase of psychological pressure, laying the groundwork for future escalation. The emotional intensity within me grew, not just from anticipation, but from the realization that control, even silent and unseen, had begun to shift in my favor. As night fell, I sat at my desk, tracing fingers over the sketches and maps that documented not only Claudine's physical movements, but her increasingly fragile sense of certainty. I imagined the scenario unfolding over weeks, her growing awareness of an unseen presence, the subtle erosion of confidence, and the eventual moment when she would have to confront the reality she had ignored for so long. The psychological pressure I had begun to apply was only the first step, but it was already effective, planting the seeds of doubt and fear that would grow over time. Sleep brought restless dreams, blending past trauma with visions of strategic influence. I saw Claudine's confident demeanor crack under subtle manipulations, imagined her questioning every movement and assumption, and rehearsed my own responses to every possible reaction. The emotional tension was palpable even in the subconscious, reinforcing the meticulous preparation that had gone into every detail of this operation. I awoke with renewed clarity and a sharper sense of purpose, ready to continue the careful orchestration that would eventually culminate in a confrontation she could not ignore. By the next day, the psychological pressure had become a persistent undercurrent in Claudine's routine. Each subtle disruption, a sketch, a shadow, a sound, added to a growing sense of uncertainty. I moved through the town with deliberate care, observing, adjusting, and reinforcing my influence without ever exposing myself. The suspense was tangible, a slow-building current that carried both anticipation and a sense of impending revelation. Every action, every observation, every strategic placement reinforced the growing tension, shaping the narrative toward an inevitable convergence. The morning light spilled unevenly across the streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend like silent observers. I moved through the town with a precision that had become second nature, rolling my wheelchair along the familiar paths while keeping every detail in mind. Claudine's routine had shifted subtly. Her movements now carried an uncharacteristic hesitancy, small pauses in her steps, the way her eyes darted toward windows and reflections. I observed this with a sense of controlled satisfaction, knowing that the groundwork I had laid over days was now rippling through her consciousness. Today's objective was to escalate, to bring the psychological tension into a realm where she might sense, not see, the presence manipulating her environment. I chose my first position carefully, near the small fountain where she often paused to rest. The sound of water created a rhythm, masking subtle noises I could use to draw her attention without revealing my position. My sketches, layered with notations and reminders, guided each calculated movement. I had begun to introduce elements that could not be ignored. A small, folded paper left where it might flutter into her line of sight, a faint marking on the pavement suggesting direction, even the gentle shift of a shadow as the sun moved. Each subtle cue was designed to seed doubt, to provoke that quiet questioning that comes before recognition, before panic. As Claudine approached, I allowed a slight noise to escape, an almost imperceptible scrape, timed to coincide with her step. Her reaction was immediate but restrained. A startled glance over her shoulder, lips pressing together, a fleeting tension in her fingers as she adjusted the strap of her bag. It was the exact response I had anticipated, and it ignited a thrill of anticipation. Each calculated action built upon the last, a layered construction of uncertainty. Claudine's sharp awareness was beginning to confront a reality she had not acknowledged. That someone, unseen yet deliberate, was influencing her world. The cafe, usually a place of calm ritual for her, became a focal point of subtle manipulation. I positioned myself so that reflections, shadows, and peripheral movements could intersect with her line of sight without direct confrontation. Every element, from the placement of chairs to the angle of sunlight on the window, was part of an orchestrated design. Claudine paused longer than usual, scanning her surroundings with a perceptible tension. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed the first cracks of internal unease. I observed this with meticulous attention, noting the slight shift of weight, the frown that formed and dissolved as she tried to rationalize the sensations she could not yet name. The afternoon brought opportunities to heighten the tension. I traced her movements through streets and alleys, leaving small, subtle markers, folded notes that seemed accidental, sketches tucked where she might catch a glimpse, shadows positioned with precision. Each action was deliberate, calculated to provoke thought and unease without revealing my presence. The psychological pressure intensified, layering each small disruption into a crescendo of uncertainty. Claudine's routine was no longer predictable. The small hesitations, the unexpected glances, the subtle recalculations in her path, all signs that my orchestration was taking hold. By early evening, Claudine's confidence showed signs of erosion. The controlled demeanor she relied upon was faltering under the invisible weight of observation. I followed at a distance, careful to remain unnoticed, yet close enough that every minor disruption, every subtle cue, carried maximum psychological impact. The sketches had evolved into detailed maps of anticipation, each line a symbol of influence, every mark a step toward confrontation without exposure. I could almost feel the shift in her internal landscape, the gradual realization that her world was being subtly rewritten, that certainty was no longer a refuge but a fragile veneer. Nightfall brought a different intensity. The quiet of the town amplified every minor sound, every small disturbance. I used this to my advantage, orchestrating movements and noises that would register in Claudine's perception without direct visibility. The rhythmic tapping of a distant object, the shadow passing at the edge of a window, each element contributed to the building tension. Claudine paused more frequently, her steps faltering slightly, her eyes scanning places that once held no significance. The psychological pressure I had cultivated over days had reached a point where her reactions became the story itself, each micro-expression and hesitation a confirmation of influence. In the solitude of my cabin, I reviewed the day with methodical precision. Each interaction, each subtle disruption, was documented and analyzed. Claudine's growing unease was not just visible in behavior but palpable in the atmosphere of her world. The sketches, once simple reflections of observation, had transformed into instruments of psychological strategy, encoding patterns of influence and preemptive anticipation. I traced lines across the paper, envisioning her next steps, predicting reactions, and preparing for the escalation that would bring confrontation closer without direct exposure. Sleep that night was restless, charged with both anticipation and strategic calculation. In dreams, I rehearsed every possible scenario, Claudine's reactions, the subtle manipulations that might trigger recognition, the moments when doubt would tip into panic. Each vision reinforced the control I held, the patience required, and the psychological tension that had been mounting for days. I awoke with clarity, aware that the next moves would define the trajectory of the confrontation, balancing the invisible hand of influence with the subtle escalation that would push Claudine toward awareness. The following morning, the tension had reached a palpable level. Claudine's steps were hesitant, her eyes darting to shadows and reflections with increasing frequency. I rolled through the streets with deliberate care, positioning myself strategically to guide perception without exposure. Each fold of paper, each mark, Each carefully orchestrated shadow contributed to a crescendo of psychological pressure. Her awareness was stretching, fracturing, bending around unseen influence, and I felt the first tangible hints of direct confrontation looming on the horizon. By midday, I knew the time was nearing. Claudine's growing unease, the micro-hesitations, the calculated glances, they were all part of a structure I had meticulously built. The first direct hint of psychological confrontation would occur soon, subtle yet undeniable. I traced paths, adjusted positions, and considered every variable. The suspense was electric, a low hum of anticipation that carried through every observation, every calculated placement, every silent intervention. Each step brought me closer to the point where influence would meet awareness, where tension would become confrontation, and where the subtle orchestration of days would bear its first visible fruit. The morning was crisp, but the weight of anticipation was suffocating. Every street, every shadow, every flicker of movement seemed amplified, charged with the invisible energy of expectation. I moved with deliberate calm, the wheelchair wheels humming softly against the cobblestones, a quiet percussion to the unfolding psychological symphony. Claudine's routine had fractured further, her confidence now tinged with suspicion, her steps hesitant and measured. Each glance she cast toward windows, reflections, or empty alleyways carried a growing awareness that she was no longer entirely in control. Today, the carefully constructed tension of the past days would reach its first direct confrontation, a moment where presence could no longer remain unseen. I chose my position near the narrow bridge she often crossed to reach the park, a place where she felt enclosed yet visible from multiple vantage points. The fountain of the previous days had prepared her subconscious. This new location added spatial complexity, forcing her to navigate a terrain that I had carefully orchestrated for psychological impact. Each element, the angle of the sunlight, the shadows of overhanging trees, the subtle sounds of water trickling, was a deliberate cue designed to provoke unease while maintaining the illusion of chance. Every detail had been considered, every factor calculated to bring her awareness to the brink. As Claudine approached, I enacted the first subtle cue of direct confrontation. A small, folded paper shifted in the breeze near her path, catching the corner of her eye. Her reaction was immediate. A pause, a tilt of the head, and the tightening of her grip on her bag strap. I could sense the internal calculation, the cognitive process of questioning perception versus reality. This was the precise moment I had engineered, the subtle awareness that something or someone was influencing her environment, that her world was no longer entirely predictable. I allowed a shadow to fall strategically across the bridge, a mere shift in my position, yet sufficient to provoke recognition. Claudine's eyes followed the movement instinctively, her breath catching slightly, a tension threading through her posture. She looked around, scanning the surroundings with a heightened vigilance, her mind processing the possibility of a presence she could not yet locate. The psychological pressure I had cultivated over days now reached a point of direct acknowledgement. She sensed it, even if she could not fully define it. The next move was subtle yet decisive. I placed another folded sketch, this one marked with faint, intentional symbols, in a location that would naturally draw her attention. Her gaze fell upon it, lingering longer than any casual observation would allow. The markings, though abstract, carried the weight of deliberate intention, a signature of influence. Claudine's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition mixed with uncertainty, and I noted every micro-expression. The slight arch of the brow, the tension around the lips, the small tightening of the jaw muscles. These were all indicators of the impact of psychological pressure translating into awareness. I rolled slowly to another vantage point, allowing the shadows and reflections to intersect with her line of sight. Each movement, though subtle, compounded the sense of presence, an invisible orchestration of tension that Claudine could not ignore. Her steps faltered. She paused, scanning the surroundings more thoroughly, questioning every ordinary object, every minor sound, every flicker of light. The careful escalation had worked. The unseen influence was now a conscious element in her perception, and she was forced to confront it, even indirectly. The emotional tension was palpable in both of us. For her, it was a mixture of uncertainty, suspicion, and growing apprehension, a cocktail of psychological vulnerability. For me, It was the thrill of anticipation and control, the satisfaction of seeing the orchestration come to fruition. Each calculated cue, each placement, each shadow or sound had built to this peak moment, the first direct confrontation without explicit revelation. Claudine's awareness had reached a level where the invisible hand manipulating her environment was acknowledged internally, yet still unidentifiable externally. As evening approached, I allowed the final cue of the day to unfold. A subtle movement, a leaf falling at an unusual angle, a faint scraping sound from above, drew her gaze upward. Her eyes widened, pupils dilated slightly, and the tension in her shoulders increased. She stopped mid-step, scanning the environment as if the invisible presence might reveal itself at any moment. This was the moment I had prepared for, the apex of psychological tension, where anticipation, recognition, and unease intersected. Claudine was on the brink of understanding, her mind fully engaged in decoding the unseen influence, yet still unable to locate the source. I stayed at a calculated distance, observing every nuance. The choreography of shadows, reflections, sounds, and cues had reached its intended effect. She was fully aware of being observed, fully aware of the subtle manipulations, and yet fully uncertain of their origin. The psychological pressure had transitioned from subtle disruption to conscious recognition, and the emotional stakes had escalated to a level where fear and curiosity intermingled. Claudine's breathing was measured but slightly uneven. The tension in her limbs betrayed a subconscious anticipation of confrontation. Returning to the cabin that night, I reviewed every action, every reaction, every detail with meticulous attention. The sketches and maps of movements were no longer just guides. They were records of psychological impact, proof that the escalation had succeeded. Claudine's reactions had confirmed the effectiveness of a strategy. The invisible influence was now acknowledged, and the stage was set for future confrontation. The emotional intensity within me was mirrored in the strategic planning for the next phase, where subtle cues would evolve into moments of direct psychological engagement. Sleep that night was restless, charged with the knowledge that the first confrontation had occurred in spirit if not in presence. Dreams blended anticipation, reflection, and rehearsal. Claudine's heightened awareness, my strategic placement, the orchestration of tension, and the slow, deliberate path toward the next climax. I awoke with clarity and determination, knowing that the next encounters would escalate the psychological game further, moving from subtle manipulation to a confrontation that would leave no room for denial. By the next morning, the town itself seemed quieter, as though sensing the heightened tension. Claudine's awareness had intensified, her steps cautious yet deliberate, her eyes constantly seeking anomalies. I rolled through the streets, maintaining precision and calm, guiding perception without exposure, orchestrating influence without revealing intent. Each movement, each cue, each shadow was calculated to build on the psychological pressure already established, pushing her toward the moment where awareness would demand acknowledgement, and where the delicate balance of fear, suspicion, and intrigue would shift toward inevitable confrontation. The evening was draped in a tense, almost suffocating stillness. Shadows stretched across the narrow streets like silent witnesses, and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind seemed amplified, echoing the heightened awareness that hung in the air. I moved with deliberate calm, every rotation of my wheelchair calculated, every pause timed with precision, every sound accounted for. Claudine had become painfully alert, her posture taut, eyes scanning every possible source of disturbance. The subtle cues and manipulations of the previous days had brought her here, to the brink of full realization. Today, the confrontation would no longer remain indirect. The psychological tension I had meticulously cultivated was about to transform into undeniable acknowledgement. I positioned myself at the edge of the park, partially concealed by the low wall and clusters of trees. This vantage point allowed me to monitor her movements while giving the environment a sense of normalcy. I let a small, calculated sound escape, a barely perceptible scrape of metal on stone, which immediately drew her gaze in my direction. Her eyes widened subtly, pupils dilating with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She paused mid-step, scanning the surroundings with an intensity that bordered on desperation. This was the precise moment I had been orchestrating, the first undeniable acknowledgement of presence without immediate exposure. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile reality with perception. I let the silence stretch, the tension thickening with every heartbeat. Claudine shifted, taking slow, deliberate steps, eyes darting from shadows to reflections to empty spaces, as if trying to locate the source of the influence that had been haunting her for days. Each micro-expression, the tightening of her jaw, the slight furrow of her brow, the subtle bite of her lip, was a confirmation of the psychological grip I had established. She was fully aware of being observed, fully aware of manipulation, and yet the invisible hand remained elusive. The emotional intensity of the moment was palpable. Her unease had reached a point where fear, suspicion, and curiosity merged into an almost tangible force. I rolled forward slightly, allowing my shadow to fall across the pathway where she would pass. Her eyes caught it instantly. The recognition was subtle at first, a slight widening, a pause in movement, but it was unmistakable. Claudine's awareness surged. She realized, at least partially, that someone was orchestrating these events with deliberate intent. The psychological dance we had been engaged in for days had reached its first direct contact, a moment where invisible manipulation became acknowledged influence. The tension between us was electric, an unspoken communication vibrating through space, charged with anticipation and fear. The next maneuver was deliberate, a controlled escalation of influence into confrontation. I positioned a folded sketch directly in her line of sight, letting it flutter gently in the breeze. Claudine's gaze was drawn to it immediately, her eyes narrowing, her fingers instinctively tightening around her bag strap. The markings on the paper, subtle, abstract, yet undeniably intentional, communicated presence without revealing identity. She studied it with a mixture of suspicion and recognition, her mind racing to interpret meaning, origin, and intent. The psychological weight of the moment intensified as she realized she was not merely imagining the disturbances, someone was actively engaging with her reality. Claudine's breathing became slightly uneven, and her steps slowed further. The subtle shift in her behavior, the hesitation, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned both foreground and background, signaled complete immersion in the confrontation. She had crossed the threshold from mere awareness to cognitive acknowledgement. She knew she was being observed, she understood manipulation was at play, yet she could not pinpoint the source. This was the apex of the psychological game, the point where tension meets emotional revelation, where fear becomes recognition, and where control begins to shift subtly. I allowed a shadow to move just beyond the reach of her direct vision, orchestrating a visual disturbance that she could perceive but not fully identify. Her head turned sharply, eyes widening as a flash of realization passed through her expression. The micro-twitches in her lips, the slight tremor in her fingers, the rapid flick of her gaze, all signs that the psychological grip had deepened. Every element, the positioning of shadows, the subtle sounds, the carefully orchestrated cues, was part of a symphony of tension, each note calculated to escalate emotion and anticipation. Claudine was now fully conscious of being in a carefully manipulated reality, and the intensity of the moment surged toward its climax. The emotional weight between us was immense. For Claudine, it was a maelstrom of fear, anger, and bewilderment, the culmination of days of subtle manipulation and growing paranoia. For me, it was the controlled satisfaction of orchestrating a psychological crescendo, the thrill of observing reactions and emotions in real time, and the anticipation of the next stage, the full confrontation that would test both awareness and resilience. Every movement, every hesitation, every subtle cue contributed to the unfolding drama, each moment meticulously calculated to heighten emotional impact. As night began to fall, the darkness amplified every subtle detail. I rolled forward slightly, allowing the interplay of light and shadow to create an almost cinematic tension. Claudine's eyes darted to every corner, every reflective surface, every silhouette. The recognition of influence, the awareness of manipulation, and the emotional impact of the confrontation coalesced into a singular, intense experience. Her body language, expressions, and micro-reactions conveyed the complete spectrum of psychological engagement, from fear to curiosity to cautious anticipation. The culmination of this encounter was near. Claudine finally paused, turning fully in my direction, her eyes scanning the environment with a mix of defiance and apprehension. The invisible presence, the orchestrated manipulations, the subtle cues, they had all led to this moment of acknowledgement. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile control with uncertainty, fear with understanding, perception with reality. The confrontation, though still indirect, had reached its peak intensity. She knew she was being watched, she understood the manipulation, and the emotional tension between observer and observed had never been greater. As I settled back into my calculated position, observing the culmination of the psychological orchestration, the atmosphere itself seemed charged with anticipation. Claudine's emotional state, heightened awareness, and recognition of influence marked a turning point in the story. The suspense was palpable, the stakes elevated, and the stage was set for future interactions where the balance of control, awareness, and emotional tension would shift yet again. The first direct confrontation had occurred, and the climax of psychological intensity had been reached, leaving both of us on the precipice of revelation and escalation. The night had settled like a heavy curtain, draping the town in quiet shadows that seemed to linger with unspoken tension. The air was thick with the residual energy of confrontation, a charged atmosphere that neither comforted nor revealed, but hung like a silent witness to the psychological storm that had just unfolded. Claudine moved through the streets with tentative steps, each one measured, as if every movement could trigger another cascade of perception, another subtle manipulation she could not yet fully identify. Her mind replayed the events over and over, dissecting each flicker of shadow, each sound, each intentional cue, trying to understand the invisible hands that had guided her awareness to this point. I watched from a distance, maintaining the careful distance that had become my signature in this delicate game of perception and influence. The emotional aftermath of the confrontation was evident in Claudine's posture, a tense curvature of her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands, the rapid yet controlled breaths that signaled both caution and residual adrenaline. She was processing the acknowledgement, the first clear recognition that she was being observed, manipulated, and challenged, yet she could not pinpoint who or what had orchestrated these moments. Her mind was a whirl of fear, curiosity, and cautious analysis, a perfect storm of emotion for strategic escalation. The streets themselves seemed complicit in this orchestration, shadows merging with the night, the occasional rustle of leaves adding subtle cues to her heightened senses. Every step she took was influenced by the residual tension, a dance between awareness and uncertainty. Claudine's internal dialogue was relentless, a loop of suspicion and reasoning that tried to reconstruct the sequence of cues and disturbances that had led to this moment. Every misstep, every glance, every moment of hesitation reinforced the psychological impression of being observed, controlled, and subtly tested. Meanwhile, I strategized the next phase, understanding that the confrontation, though intense, was only the beginning. The emotional impact on Claudine had reached a high point, but the story had to maintain momentum. Each subtle reaction she displayed, her narrowed eyes, the faint arch of her eyebrows, the slight pause before moving forward, was a data point, a confirmation that the psychological tension had penetrated deep enough to prepare her for the next layer of manipulation. The anticipation of the upcoming encounters, the careful placement of cues, and the escalation of psychological pressure would be the instruments through which the next phase unfolded. Claudine's awareness had transformed her environment into a labyrinth of uncertainty. Ordinary objects, familiar streets, and everyday sounds now carried the weight of potential significance. A leaf brushing the pavement, a distant dog barking, a shadow slipping across a wall, all became elements of heightened alertness. Her mind parsed these details obsessively, a blend of fear and analysis that mirrored the intensity of the direct confrontation she had just experienced. The emotional aftermath was a complex tapestry of vulnerability, caution, and subconscious readiness, perfectly setting the stage for further escalation. As I monitored from my strategic vantage point, I allowed subtle cues to linger without immediate escalation. The art of psychological tension is not in constant action, but in controlled restraint, allowing the mind of the observed to fill gaps with anticipation and uncertainty. Claudine's heightened state meant that even minor disturbances, a faint sound, a barely perceptible shadow, a misaligned object, would be amplified in her perception. This orchestration created a living, breathing environment of suspense, one where anticipation became a character of its own, guiding emotional reactions and sustaining tension. The aftermath was also emotional in a more intimate sense. Claudine's mind wrestled with the implications of acknowledgement. The direct confrontation had shattered her assumption of normalcy, revealing an unseen layer of influence she could not fully comprehend. Fear mixed with fascination, uncertainty with curiosity, and suspicion with grudging respect for the precision of the unseen orchestrator. Every reaction, every hesitant glance, every deliberate pause signaled the internal struggle of a mind forced to reconcile control with vulnerability, recognition with denial. From my perspective, the emotional aftermath was equally significant. Observing the depth of processing, the subtle behavioral shifts, and the signs of heightened vigilance provided the perfect insight into timing, strategy, and psychological thresholds. Every twitch of the hand, every rapid scan of the environment, every moment of hesitation informed the next steps. The game of influence and perception is as much about observation after the confrontation as during it, and these moments of reflection and processing are where strategy deepens, anticipation sharpens, and emotional tension solidifies. As night deepened, Claudine retreated to spaces that offered some semblance of privacy, yet her mind remained acutely aware. The confrontation had left indelible traces, and every subsequent sound, shadow, and flicker carried weight. The emotional resonance of acknowledgement reverberated through her thoughts, intensifying vigilance and forcing cognitive engagement with even the smallest environmental anomalies. She could not afford to fully relax, and this sustained tension became a critical element of the unfolding narrative, a psychological bridge to the next phase of engagement. I continued to monitor, rolling slowly to maintain optimal vantage points, allowing subtle shadows and reflective surfaces to interact with her line of sight. The orchestration of anticipation relied on these minute adjustments, the interplay of light and dark, the rhythm of environmental sound, the careful calibration of movement. Claudine's responses, hesitation, scanning, subtle shifts in posture, confirmed that the environment itself had become a conduit for psychological influence. Every small reaction reinforced the emotional impact of the direct confrontation and set the stage for further escalation. The night concluded with a sense of unresolved tension, an emotional echo that would carry into the next day. Claudine's processing had not ended. The confrontation had planted seeds of awareness, uncertainty, and heightened vigilance that would guide behavior, perception, and emotional response. From my perspective, the aftermath was as crucial as the confrontation itself, a period where subtle anticipation and psychological groundwork ensured that the next stage would resonate more deeply, emotionally and cognitively. By the first light of dawn, the town remained quiet, but the energy lingered, a silent current between observer and observed, tension and anticipation, manipulation and recognition. Claudine's awareness had reached a critical threshold, her emotional state primed for the next engagement. The aftermath had achieved its purpose, a heightened psychological environment, a mind now fully engaged in perception and anticipation, and a narrative tension that promised deeper, more intense encounters to come. Every detail, every observation, every subtle emotional cue had contributed to the preparation for the next phase, ensuring that the story would continue to unfold with maximum suspense, emotional resonance, and strategic precision. The early morning sun filtered through the lingering haze of night, casting pale streaks across the quiet streets. Shadows clung stubbornly to corners and alleyways, as if reluctant to surrender the secrets they had harbored during the tense darkness. I adjusted my wheelchair slightly, rolling forward with precise control, each movement calculated to maintain the perfect vantage. This was the culmination of days of careful orchestration, subtle manipulation, and psychological escalation. Today would be the final act of this intricate game, a confrontation where the culmination of tension, emotion, and awareness would meet strategic precision. Claudine moved with a slow, almost hesitant awareness. Her posture, still tense from the previous night, betrayed an emotional cocktail of fear, suspicion, and curiosity. Every glance, every subtle tilt of the head, every moment of hesitation was a signal that she was fully immersed in the psychological labyrinth I had designed. She knew the rules now, she understood the game. Yet the identity of the orchestrator remained shrouded in ambiguity. This delicate balance, Her acknowledgement, coupled with uncertainty, was precisely the edge I needed for the final phase. I let a subtle sound escape, a barely perceptible scraping along the curb, followed by a faint whisper of movement. Claudine froze immediately, eyes narrowing as she scanned the street. Her awareness was acute, every sense tuned to detect the invisible presence she knew lingered somewhere close. I allowed the suspense to stretch, prolonging the anticipation. This was not just about confrontation, it was about emotional dominance, a careful dance between fear and recognition, control and chaos. Her mind raced to reconstruct the unseen orchestration, to predict the next move, but uncertainty remained her constant companion. Slowly, I revealed myself, just enough to become perceptible without fully exposing every detail. The first glimpse was indirect, a shadow, a reflection in a window, a faint outline visible only if she looked carefully. Claudine's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, and she instinctively moved backward, away from the subtle revelation. The psychological impact was profound. 4 days, she had been hunting an invisible presence. Now, that presence was partially revealed, validating every fear, every suspicion, and amplifying the tension to its peak. I allowed the moment to stretch, observing the micro-expressions that danced across her face. The slight quiver of her lips, the narrowing of her eyes, the subtle trembling of her hands, all were signs of the emotional storm that had been building to this climax. Claudine was fully aware now, fully engaged in the confrontation, and yet still uncertain of my identity and full intent. This uncertainty was crucial. Fear without clarity, recognition without resolution, anticipation without action. These were the instruments that made the final act emotionally charged and suspenseful. As she moved forward cautiously, I created a series of cues, small, deliberate signals that guided her attention without forcing direct action. A reflective surface caught her eye, a faint rustle of leaves drew her gaze, a carefully placed object shifted in her peripheral vision. Each cue was a brushstroke in a psychological painting, designed to elevate emotion, sharpen perception, and maintain suspense. Claudine responded instinctively, every micro-movement a testament to the depth of engagement that had been carefully cultivated over days of strategic orchestration. Then came the turning point. I positioned myself within her direct line of sight, allowing my shadow to fall across the path where she could clearly perceive it. Her eyes locked onto the silhouette, recognition dawning in her expression. The subtle mixture of fear, realization, and awe painted her face with the intensity of someone confronting the culmination of a carefully laid psychological puzzle. She understood the stakes, the precision, and the inevitability of the confrontation. Her breath quickened, her heart raced, and every instinct screamed at her to retreat, but curiosity and the compulsion to resolve uncertainty held her in place. The emotional breaking point was near. Claudine's mind reeled, attempting to reconcile the fear, recognition, and anticipation that now collided in an overwhelming wave. Her body trembled, a mixture of tension and adrenaline coursing through her, while her eyes never left the partially revealed presence. I maintained control, guiding perception with subtle movements, small changes in shadow and reflection, letting the psychological impact unfold naturally. Each adjustment was deliberate, designed to amplify emotion, extend suspense, and ensure that every second of the climax carried weight. Finally, the resolution, yet intentionally incomplete, leaving a lingering thread of suspense. I allowed a clear reveal of my presence, enough for Claudine to see the orchestrator, yet not every intention or plan fully visible. The combination of acknowledgement, partial revelation, and lingering mystery created a tension that reached its emotional apex. Claudine's fear transformed into a complex blend of respect, awe, and lingering unease. She understood the mastery of manipulation she had faced, yet the story did not fully conclude. Its psychological resonance continued to ripple, leaving her mind and emotions in a state of heightened awareness. The streets returned to quiet, but the emotional and psychological impact remained electric. Claudine's processing, the recognition of influence, and the confrontation's climax left an indelible mark. From my perspective, the strategic orchestration was a success. Tension had been escalated to peak levels, emotions had been fully engaged, and suspense had been sustained until the final revelation. Yet, the story remained open-ended, with a subtle promise of continuation, hinting at future confrontations and deeper layers of engagement. In the aftermath, I allowed a slow, deliberate withdrawal, maintaining just enough presence for awareness to linger. Claudine's reactions, hesitation, scanning, subtle adjustments in posture, confirmed that the narrative tension had not dissipated. The emotional closure was partial, complete in intensity but open in resolution, leaving readers and viewers with a lingering sense of anticipation and a powerful connection to the psychological journey. The story concluded on a high note of suspense and emotion, fully satisfying in its climax while leaving room for future intrigue. The final moments were a careful balance: emotional intensity, psychological precision, and narrative closure. Claudine's awareness, fear, and respect intertwined to form a complex emotional landscape, while the orchestrated actions ensured that suspense and engagement remained at peak levels. The story, now fully realized, offered a complete arc of psychological escalation, emotional resonance, and suspenseful closure, yet its subtle open-endedness hinted at further chapters, keeping anticipation alive and ensuring lasting impact.